I thought I had a really great opening question, but then another one sort of eclipsed that one. I'm not sure if it's great, but I remember we were talking about last time, I think it was the sort of meta topic came up about interpretation, and is are Deleuze and Guattari setting out their understanding of the unconscious and so on as sort of the correct interpretation, or are they provide, are they, and what I suggested, or at least the way I think about it is, well, there are better and worse interpretations, and I think there's better for so-and-so reasons. But actually, there's some passages in this first in 2.6 that are interesting in that regard. It was I'm trying, I'm not being greatly successful, but trying to read the commentary by Eugene, is it, Holland, on this book, and he brings this up, sort of highlighted a bit on page 109 at the bottom. They say, analysis term transcendental is precisely the determination of these criteria imminent to the field of the unconscious, insofar as they are opposed to the transcendent exercise of a what does it mean. Schizoanalysis is at once a transcendental and a materialist analysis. And then on the next page, 110 at the very top, the first full paragraph, thus we have already seen how the immanent criteria of desiring production permitted a definition of legitimate uses of syntheses, uses completely distinct from Oedipal use. And in relation to this desiring production, the Oedipal illegitimate uses seem to us to be multiform, but always to revolve around the same error and to envelop theoretical and practical paralogisms. And then they go through these three paralogisms that they think the Oedipus view commits. And then toward the end of the section, I'll just read this sentence on page 112. The practical problem of schizoanalysis is then to ensure the contrasting reversion, restoring the syntheses of the unconsciousness of the unconscious to their immanent use. And so, he says in that second quotation, I think, we've already seen how the immanent criteria of desiring production permitted a definition of legitimate uses of the syntheses. So he thinks there are legitimate and illegitimate uses. And that's pretty strong language. I mean, he's, they're saying, that our use is a legitimate use and psychoanalysts' use is an illegitimate use. And, however you take that, it has the ring of right and wrong. This is the right use, the correct use, and that's the incorrect use. And unfortunately for me, he says, we've already seen how the immanent criteria of desiring production, he says, we've already seen. So apparently it was the last few chapters that were supposed to convince me of that. Unfortunately, as is the case with both these guys and Lacan, I never actually understand everything they're saying. So I don't really have a sense of how they justified these, how the criteria are immanent and even what the criteria are. But I thought that was maybe an interesting thing to start with, is there's, to what degree are they claiming we have a correct way of looking at this stuff and psychoanalysis has an incorrect, or at least maybe just use their words, legitimate and illegitimate. Again, it seems to be pretty strong language.
I have some sort of something, I guess, quasi answer to that. It's sort of something that formulated in my head while you were saying that, and it's something that I've been thinking about as I read the book. And it seems like they, by saying schizoanalysis and well, like Lacan is like a radical rereading of Freud, right? And they're kind of doing that too. both of Lacan and Freud, but they're calling it something different, and they're trying to separate themselves from psychoanalysis, and an attempt, I think, to avoid, I don't know, criticisms of Lacan, for being Freudian, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think Lacan said one time to his followers, "You can be Lacanian if you want. I'm a Freudian," and but in a sense, I think in what they're actually doing is, like, especially with Lacan, there's so many different readings of him, because he was, he's he moves around. It's not, there's not, there isn't a, orthodox, or maybe there is orthodox, but there's also unorthodox readings of Lacan. So I think maybe, and I think that, to the degree that there's Deleuzian studies that's quite successful, right? They've separated themselves, but I think it's a kind of a trick that they did by saying that, by saying that this is, we're anti-Oedipus, or, we're critiquing psychoanalysis and replacing it with something else. At least that's the impression that I've gotten thus far. And I think that that's somehow connected to what you're saying, Nevitt, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I was going to note on page 108 at the bottom, they actually list 3 different forms of psychoanalysis. And not knowing either Freud or Lacan, not knowing Freud well and Lacan at all, I don't know if they're referring, I'm guessing they're referring to Lacan. They mention Mendel, Hoyer, and somebody else, but they say that, like, there's these 3 different interpretations and they're all wrong for different reasons. And I can understand some of their criticisms. Like, for example, they seem to think that psychoanalysis restricts legitimate identities to just a very few social identities. And I'm not qualified to judge whether they're correct about that, but they say, psychoanalysis, this Oedipus project, reduces the potential social identities to just a few, whereas theirs allow for a vast diversity of and fluid identities. So that's one thing. And then they also, like in this next chapter, they seem to be saying, and again, I'm not sure I'm characterizing this correctly, but the psychoanalysis and Lacan claim that the cause of repression is psychological, whereas they're saying, seem to be saying, it's exclusively social. That you've got these social forces that generate repression, and then there's this weird interpretive reversal that makes it seem as if it's coming from this internal thing. They think, and I think, they're concerned about things like that because, again, they're worried about misidentifying the origin of repression, which I assume they mean they think has real social import. And so they list all these different ways in which they think psychoanalysis has had pernicious implications, but this passage I was pointing to those seem to be pernicious effects of psychoanalysis, whereas what they're, and if that was what they were focusing on as why they think their thing is better, you could accuse them of kind of an ought-is fallacy. In other words, you think that what ought to be the case is thus and so, and therefore you're going to say, that the reason that we should be critical of psychoanalysis is because, it doesn't do what it ought to do. But what at least in this part, what they're claiming is the criticism is more fundamental. They get something fundamentally wrong about the nature of desire and the way the way that they interpret these 3 syntheses and the way they apply these 3 syntheses. And then those fundamental problems are what generate, at least that's what it seems to me, generate what they view as pernicious effects.
Yeah, the first part of what you said, the psychoanalyst is cop, the quote that's on bottom of 108. I mean, I feel like a lot of that stuff, it's at least, I mean, it doesn't contradict Lacan. It's just I think that their you know, their primary target is like clinical psychoanalysis as it was at that time, and Lacan took shots at that too. And that's why I think that, well, like Hunter said in the Discord, something I think about Lacan not going far enough for these guys for D&G, and it's almost like they're just doing what he does more and off in a different direction or something. But and then the thing that, this is where I'm still not clear on this thing about desire is productive. They have a problem with the idea of desire being a lack, which is Lacan and Freud's thing, and I don't really I mean, my response to it when I'm reading and stuff is when they say desire is not a lack, desire is productive, et cetera, et cetera. My response is simply, yes, it is. So, you know, I don't really know what to do with that.
Yeah, I wanted to discuss that in the part. I have it highlighted here when he says the three errors, because it seems that they're saying that desire is an empty position rather than a deprivation. Because on page 111, he says that, and it is futile to interpret these notions in terms of combative apparatus, uno combinator, that makes of lack an empty position and no longer of deprivation, that turns law into a rule of game and no longer a commandment, in the signifier into a distributor and no longer a meaning. And I underlined empty position because it seems that they're suggesting that desire should be an empty position rather than deprivation or lack, like you said, and that the law should be the rule of the game rather than a commandment, like an axiomatic principle, and the signifier should be a distributor, like the pusher of this constant production that we have. So that, like, it seems like he's saying desire, when we are in this ideological construct and view it as a lack, takes away from this materialist psychology viewpoint of us being producing machines. Like, we're constantly producing. There's always an and an and and an and, and it shouldn't be a lack. It should be something that is seen as kind of like a blank slate, rather than us being deprived of something. So when we look at stuff as us being deprived of something, we're letting that theological construct determine what that is, rather than starting at like a blank slate as the body without organs, is how I interpret it. And I wanted to ask Chase about that, because that's where I was getting a little confused as well.
So one thing, I'm sorry, Aiden, you had your hand up. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no worries. Yeah, I really like that idea that like with lack, in this sense, I've been understanding it as like being complete in its incompleteness, where like what if we were to bring Marx more into this, I'm kind of just going off of like my understanding rather than what the book was saying, which might be a very fatal error. But if that's the case, then somebody can definitely come in and show me how wrong I am. But if we're talking about like desire in terms with like commodity fetishism, where it's like producing like an object of desire, where desire will latch onto it, and you know it kind of creates this illusion that like there is a fixed object that desire like needs to possess in order to where the idea is that desire is incomplete as itself.
Kind of like I didn't know I wanted a Big Mac till I saw that commercial, and now I feel like if I don't have that Big Mac, it's like I'm not gonna feel complete. And then when I eat it, I feel less complete, and I'm looking for something else to tell me what it is I want. Maybe I want the new chicken sandwich, you know, or something like that. I want, and I'm curious too, like how that it almost sounds like the objet Lacan talks about all the time. In a way. So I don't know, is that what they're saying when they feel like he hasn't gone far enough when it comes to desire, that he's still looking at it from a Freudian aspect of, you know, we're letting this idea of lack permeate everything?
Okay, so I think the lack thing, God, So tiring. Oh,
We love you, Chase.
there's a lot.
Thank you for your
Tiring,
help.
but-
I know you're so tired.
It's just okay. So
All right, before you launch into this, Chase, I'm gonna have to throw my voice in with Nathan and Hunter. I still think they have yet to demonstrate that lack doesn't, or that desire doesn't imply a lack somewhere in there. You know what I mean? Like, so sorry, I'm gonna let you get started here soon, Chase. I just wanted to backtrack a bit. Because Nevitt started with, like, they're proposing that their interpretation of the unconscious is better than previous interpretation. And I've got some sympathy for this approach because I appreciate that they're doing something Kantian, somewhat Kantian, you know, going for a transcendental approach. And they're, by analogy, I'm seeing, you know, they're accusing Freud and their contemporary psychoanalyst, you know, clinical psychoanalysts of doing something like a transcendent metaphysics. And they're looking for the ground, like how is this even possible? Which I appreciate the method or the approach, but I don't feel like they do a Kantian deduction, you know, where they make it plausible that this must be the case for such and such to be possible, and only this must be the case for such and such to be possible. Just by way of analogy, you know, again, I think in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant makes a pretty good case that certain things must pertain in order for experience to be possible. It's not watertight, but it's a pretty good case. I don't see that Deleuze and Guattari have really argued their case in terms of a deduction. You know what I mean? I think they're mostly like Kant, you know, like attacking transcendent metaphysics, showing paralogisms. I like antinomies though. If they could show me some antinomies, that would be helpful too. But at least by pointing out paralogisms and what's wrong with this transcendent version of psychoanalysis, I appreciate that, but they're not really arguing their transcendental ground of desire production, right? And this must be the case. And again, in agreement with Nathan and Hunter, I still think of desire as lack. There was another point I was going to make. Also, there's a piece of me that still resents, you know, to whatever of me is desirous, that it's related as machinic. You know what I mean? Like, to me, that's suspicious, right? That everything has to be machinic in the unconscious, and that's the transcendental ground. You know, like, to me, if it's machinic, it probably comes from the superstructure, and you know what I mean, like impedes on my being, rather than my natural being is actually machinic. You know what I mean? Like, I haven't. That's another issue. Anyway, sorry. You know, I hope I didn't like hijack right there, but I just wanted to throw that in there because before you launch, Chase.
yeah. So okay, I'll start with the kind of this criteria that, you know, the question of the criteria. So the way I interpret its meaning, which is what they're saying is a kind of secondary thing, but the way I see it is that the criteria is based off of what you can actually produce. If desire is indeed revolutionary, then if they can help kind of unlock that production of desire, that itself is the criteria. And I think, you know, whether or not it's so there's kind of like this even at Kant, I think he's trying to do something, you know, he's trying to establish something apodictic. He's trying to prove something with certainty, and I think that is not at all what they're trying to do. I think what they're trying to do is instead kind of propel, use the machine of the book itself as a part of desiring production in order to help foment more desiring production. And the more that you can unlock this productive desire, that's really the criterion right there. And, you know, it's what does it do? What can it do? Not what does it mean? What does it prove exactly? Although those things are definitely still related, but I think ultimately that's the thing. And what is an imminent use of the syntheses, I think, are just use of the syntheses that actually pertain to what they can do. So if you can somehow unlock this aspect of desire that is indeed what the unconscious does, it pertains to the unconscious, then that is an imminent use of them. Where if you use them in some way where it has this object of desire that isn't corresponding to, I guess, just the nature of how it actually functions and works, then that's the transcendent use. I feel like they would probably not find that the critique very I imagine Deleuze hearing a critique like that and just being like, oh, okay, who cares? Basically, what did it do? I read this one, so he had this kind of lecture he gave, and then at the end of it, there's a Q&A, and somebody said, well, what about Heidegger and Derrida? Like, this didn't follow Heidegger, and what's wrong with you? Like, don't you care about this? And he just said, no, I don't. Actually, that's good. Thank you for recognizing that I don't care about Heidegger or Derrida. I'm doing my own thing. So I think there's something like that gets unlocked in that. Okay, so Guattari, he's engaged in all this practical, real activity, politically, clinically, working at the board, and I think that's where it kind of, the idea is, okay, let's use basically a kind of this Deleuzian philosophy, but kind of weaponize it in order to understand these particular things occurring in society, and use it as a weapon against those forces that are repressive, and also at the same time, in order to do something creative, you have to also do something destructive simultaneously. So, and that's a kind of a common theme with Deleuze, is that you have to, whether it's like the dogmatic image of thought, or it's the cliche in painting, you have to first kind of break away these molds that are already there, in order to then have some kind of freedom to do something novel. And I think there's something like that too, in that it's okay. There's this kind of straitjacket of this Oedipal form. The idea is get rid of that in order to better kind of release those flows, and the more you can release those flows, that's just the more you can actually do something, if desire is indeed productive. And then there's the criteria right there. Use the book or don't use it. I mean, even if you use the book in your thesis to write like a Lacanian critique of it, that's a use of it. So who knows? That seems like a imminent use of the syntheses, possibly. I don't know. I'm somewhat joking there, but yeah, what else? I thought there was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember, so whatever.
Okay, I have a thought. I have thoughts. I have several. One, I don't know. Okay, yes. Well, first, yeah, I thought, okay, it was kind of weird. I was kind of confronting two streams of info at once. and yet I wasn't necessarily being overwhelmed. I don't know if it's, I don't know. I'm starting to open myself up to multiple lines of flight at once. I'm feeling the change. You know, my territory is opening. You know, I'm overflowing. Yeah, exactly. But Chase, I really liked your response towards the yeah, like this kind of, we're trying to begin this conversation to lack in legitimacy, and then Joey confronting some of my concerns in the chat regarding like fixation on productivity. And okay, I had a way, basically I wanted to do two things to try and I guess simplify the terms of the discussion for a second without missing out on the I get higher minded content, but with some maybe more baseline discussion for a second. And in order to do that, in order to get there, it's a question I have, but in order to get there, I wanted to start by answering a thing that Nevitt asked me in the Discord. I think just today. He said, I'd like if you could maybe just say one or two things about the capacities of the unconscious, at least relative to my understanding of what Lacan would say, or is the capacity of the unconscious. And Nevitt, you know what I'm talking about, right? That you talking about, yes, okay. Then Chase discussed the capacity of the unconscious, and how much does it cover, how big, you know, what does it do, what can it do, what are its limits or whatever. And my answer is basically this, at least as far as I know Lacan is saying, which, I mean, a lot of my knowledge of Lacan just comes from, you know, small essays, secondhand resources, and brief aphorisms. It's that the unconscious is structured like a language. The unconscious is the effect of language on a subject. That's the definition of the unconscious. The unconscious is the effect of language on a subject. And the effect of language being this really central point for Lacan, as we are beings of language, or these symbolic creatures basically caught in this drive to symbolize and to pull things into our pattern recognition and establish things that we call meaning, which I think Lacan sometimes he's kind of sympathetic to the notion of meaning, like, you know, leading a meaningful life or whatever. And other times he's just radically like critical. He's very like, look, meaning is just a signifier falling into the place of the signified, which is just an illusion, you know. So, okay, so you could go back. He would say that the unconscious is structured like a language, being that it's the effect of a language on a subject. It is, and to further these different aphorisms, you know, that or these little one-liners that I've sort of said before, the desire is the desire of the other. The unconscious is structured like a language. Where do we, yeah, it's not structured like a language. It's more like a big X with a weird shape through it. If you really read him, he draws a lot of pictures. That's one thing he does. And that is like weirdly much more, like the diagrams take many hours of like YouTube tutorials to understand. Like the actual diagram of desire, it's like a weird hoop stick thing that is, if he just describes it in a paragraph, it doesn't make any much more sense, but it's a little bit more tangible. Otherwise, it's just this, yeah. But so structured like a language, the effect of language on a subject. Language is given to he says animals live in a realm of code. Yes, thank you, Nathan. Yes, animals live by codes. They don't necessarily live in a realm of symbols and signifiers like we do. Yeah, I don't think a dog, that's why dogs can have sex in a public park. I wrote about this in the Discord. Dogs can have sex in a public park and nobody, you know, raises an eye. But when I do it, it's suddenly a big disaster. It's a problem. Or if anybody were to start doing it, there's at least the capacity for taboo. There's the fall from Eden or whatever in language, in symbols or whatever, but it's not that simple. My point is, okay, back to serious. My point is, language and the unconscious as the effect of language is largely located or seated, if we want to analyze it, in this scene called the big other. He says very explicitly, signifiers are articulated on this other scene. This other scene, like imagine, think about it like this, basically. If I could just try and give it like a sort of sensory illustration. You, if I, like, I know that this is not a proper way to say this, but like you are in one place and your surrounding cultural, historical, mythopoetic, whatever you want to call it, landscape is around you. Again, even just saying you is kind of weird, but you, from the time of being a like infant, of being, the first day you were born, inundated with this surrounding set of symbols and signifiers that indicate certain things. And maybe you're reprimanded for it, maybe you're not, whatever. It's sure. In a sense, yeah, anthropocentric, yeah, but animals are stupid. Sorry, I don't dismiss it as a joke. But you're inundated with language. And this language, you were inundated with this language, not just from the ether. It's not like God has a divine proboscis that injects meaning and visions into your brain. It's other people telling you words and using signifiers and symbols around you in a pattern. You know what I mean? And so what I'm saying is language comes from others. And this space of you and the others that are producing or inundating you with language, right? In that interspace, that interstice or whatever, that to me, I guess, is the best I can kind of try to illustrate this idea of this other scene where signifiers are articulated. And so the unconscious is transpersonal by its very nature, in a limited sense. It's transpersonal by its very nature. This is where Jung comes from, where he says it's so transpersonal that there are universal archetypes located in a space called the collective unconscious. And I think Lacan and a lot of Lacanians say he's going a little far. Whoa there, but he's taking that idea and running with it. And Lacan is stopping it, saying, well, it's transpersonal, given that it's structured like a language, and language comes to us from others around us who are speaking that language. If I was born here or there, hither or thither, I would speak the language of hither or thither. But so we have this idea of the meaning of language coming from others, right? Or coming from the articulation, the meaning of language in the unconscious coming from the articulation of signifiers on the big other. I'm trying to just say that right now for the recording in the most official, jargony way possible. Just the meaning of signifiers being derived from the articulation of those signifiers on the scene called the big other. Now, here's the counter, and this is how I'm trying to slide us back to Deleuze. On page 109, it was that page that Nevitt, where you talk about analysis term transcendentalist, precisely the determination, blah, blah, blah. On that same page, they say something, you pointed that out, and I hadn't thought about that, but that is a fascinating line of questioning that I'm interested in. And in order to get there, I want to ask maybe a more basic question, and it's, on page 109, they have this line that says, the unconscious poses, and this is on the second paragraph of page 109, the unconscious poses no problem of meaning, solely problems of use. The question posed by desire is not what does it mean, but rather how does it work? How do these machines, desiring machines, work, yours and mine? With what sort of breakdowns as a part of their functioning? How do they pass from one body to the other? How are they attached? La, la, la. And then let's see, there is okay. Okay. In fact, there's a sentence about 3/4 the way down that paragraph. They have a very interesting sentence. It says, but on condition that meaning be nothing other than use, that it become a firm principle only if we have at our disposal, imminent criteria capable of determining the legitimate uses, as opposed to the illegitimate ones that relate us instead to a hypothetical meaning and reestablish a kind of transcendence. Here's my big question. I took a philosophy of language course where we read this big book that said there are 3 basic ways to approach language. Where does meaning come from in language? Things in the world, ideas in the mind or use. Wittgenstein is in the use camp. Berkeley's in the ideas camp. Russell is in the things. So where do we get the meaning from our words? Where do our words get meaning? From things directly that it's referring to, from ideas in our mind, or from the way it's used? And so okay. maybe they confront this question a little bit more directly in the next text, in what we're going to end up probably reading in the fall, maybe. But my question is, are Deleuze and Guattari in the use camp? Do they see, is there no meaning to language but use? And as such, does immanent criteria of the thing determine legitimate use? And if it's immanent, does that bar abstraction? And then also, Nevitt posed a really good question. Does legitimate really mean useful for revolution? I find that a very interesting question, because it seems kind of like it. So do they believe that language gets its meaning from use? And does that use's legitimacy depend on its immanent criteria? And does that bar abstraction? That's my three-part question. That's it.
So I'll try to give a short answer, and I'll just say that I don't think they're saying that that use is the meaning. They're trying to get rid of the whole kind of criterion of meaning as the final criterion, and instead shift it to use. So instead, a better question would be like, is the meaning, okay. So your question was, is use the arbiter of meaning, or something like that? They would probably, you could maybe even reverse that and say, well, is the meaning the arbiter of use? In other words, how can we get a meaning to be used properly, which means productively? I think that would be more where they're going. They would definitely not want to just kind of stamp use back onto meaning. And and logic of sense argues very much against that in terms of the sense of what a proposition means. Let's see, I'm not going to go into a bunch of this, but so in logic of sense, Deleuze says that demarcation, pointing out states of affairs in the world, manifestation, manifesting my subjective desires and beliefs and intentions, and signification, which is kind of pointing to the order, the semantic order of logical constructions, but also these kind of universal concepts and whatnot. None of those constitute the sense of a proposition, and instead they actually have a kind of circular structure where they all presuppose each other. So I think, I'm not sure where use would go in those exactly. Maybe something like, is that demarcation? Is that manifestation? I'm not really sure, but it's definitely not the sense of a proposition. So I think that, and it's not the significance of a proposition either. So I'm not sure, but at least that's my answer.
But
I wonder if part of his insistence on the question of how does it work is again, I'm not all sure about this, but I get the sense that they're looking for something, in a sense, kind of underneath that is like, so this whole transcendental thing is like, what are the conditions for the possibility of? But he's a transcendental empiricist, Deleuze is, and so he thinks that there are something is happening under the hood in a sense that is giving rise to phenomena. And in difference and repetition, it's pure difference in itself. I mean, here maybe it's desire, I don't know, or desiring machines, but there's something that's giving rise to our experience and to the world. And in terms of what works, I mean, I wonder if that's part of what he means is what works is this. And I mean, granted, machinic sounds kind of inhuman, but I think that's probably intentional, because again, subjectivity and consciousness are not the primary generators of reality. Or even like one comment I made in Discord is, for Kant, the transcendental field is a transcendental ego. But for Deleuze, there's not a transcendental ego, because what's generative of the conditions of experience in the world is not an ego. It's a set of processes that produce these things, including, I think, Chase can correct me, but subjectivity and eventually consciousness. And so subjectivity and consciousness are not the kind of locus of productivity. They are part of what is produced. And so I'm wondering if part of what he's saying in this notion of how does it work, it's like, like literally what are the systems that are at work here and that are generating all these different experiences and phenomena and so on. And when you start asking questions of like, well, what does it mean, now what you're doing is you're moving into some sort of domain that necessarily includes conscious interpretation. This means this, or this means that, this has this value, this has that value. And, like they keep railing against myths, so Oedipus is a myth that we use he would say, to construct some sort of meaning out of all of this. But he's not, I think at this level, they're not interested in myths and meanings. They're interested in like what's under the hood, what processes, generative processes are at work. And again, one of his things is productive unconscious versus, what's the other word? Expressive unconscious. So for him, or for them, this process is productive. It's not merely expressive. It's not that this unconscious merely expresses something like maybe a meaning or something, but there's this productive engine that is generating these things. And so, I mean, I'm wondering if part of this notion of how does it work has to do with that. We're interested in kind of like the engine underneath this thing, and how does it work?
That was well said. I have no complaints. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, go ahead, David.
Oh, I was just going to say I had a note that I wanted to throw out for people to play with. I wanted to say that, and I've got two citations. At times, it seems like D&G they're saying the Oedipus complex exists, but it's socially produced. So to that, I would say I don't see who they're arguing with, because I mean, maybe in Freud's time, some people would have said that was some kind of human thing, like transcultural or whatever. But I feel like after Lévi-Strauss, after Althusser, no one's going to say that it's, Lacan didn't say that. Nobody was saying that. No structuralist or post-structuralist would say that. That's what that stuff's about, is that it's all created by language. It's all created by us. It's not, there is nothing intrinsic here, right? So, and that's on bottom of page 118 is where I'm getting that, where they say, or it's the bottom of the second paragraph, that the family is indeed the delegated agent of this psychic repression. We're talking about the complex, right? Insofar as it ensures a mass psychological reproduction of the economic system of a society. Of course, it should not be concluded from this that desire is Oedipal, On the contrary, it is the social repression of desire or sexual repression, that is the stasis of libidinal energy, that actualizes Oedipus and engages desire in this requisite impasse organized by the repressive society. So they're saying that society creates the complex, but that it exists, like it's real. And then like on other times, it seems like they're saying it doesn't exist at all. It's not something that happens. It's something that's grafted onto a pre-existing positive and productive desire. So at the top of page 121, the last sentence in the first paragraph on 121, desiring production taken as a whole does not assume the well-known Oedipal figure except in the familial translation of its recording, translation betrayal. And then they say, to be sure, we have never dreamed of saying that psychoanalysis invented Oedipus. So I may be making a fine distinction. But to me, it's something that jumped out. It's like, it seems like sometimes they want to say that it's just this, well, let's say machine or model that they use, where they say like, oh, of course, that's the explanation. So that's why I feel this way. Like people just sort of submit to Oedipus because they're told that that's what's happening. And of course, that's a real phenomenon. I'm not arguing with that. But then other times they say that it is something that actually happens. There is something Oedipal going on, at least in the mother, father, child dynamic, that's actually happening. But, but it's actually the family is an agent of a repressive culture. But is what I'm saying making sense? Like, do you guys know what I mean? Like they're saying two different things, it seems like sometimes.
Yeah, they seem to almost be saying, like the way I interpret it too, is that they're both a transcendental and a materialist approach. They're not interested in metaphysics or meaning or intent. They are looking at the undulating ideology and the functions of the machine and what part is being superimposed and what is not. So it is to me less metaphysics and more transcendental and materialist in one go. Is that an accurate?
I mean, that's what I'm getting at, which is it's interesting.
So I think.
No, go ahead.
Yes, I think the distinction that they make, so there's one aspect where they're arguing against this idea that it's something universal, or that it can be used as something, as a one size fits all interpretive method, where everything comes down to Oedipus in some way, and it's kind of the overriding structure that everything is used to interpret some neurosis or whatever. But then part of the problem with that would be that that's pointing to some kind of psychic repression and saying that that's the genesis of these things. And so I think one of the major things that they're doing in that last section is saying that we need to understand first the kind of the primacy of social repression and how that causes this unit of psychic repression, which for Oedipus is the family. That's the nuclear family structure. But that psychic repression causes desire to desire social repression. So it causes this circle of kind of repressing itself. And I think that's the thing that they're getting at. But so that's kind of how Oedipus is produced, is that there's some kind of social repression, which eventually they're going to get into in the third chapter. But this is what causes then the way I think to kind of give a short summary, I guess, of it that seems somewhat plausible is that, okay, you've got, modern society and capitalism and all this cool stuff, all these cool gadgets like we got here. We're on Zoom. Wow, we're talking to each other. Isn't that cool? Okay, so there's a kind of a trajectory of society, you could say, that has been led to a kind of atomization of people and has led towards a kind of individualism that's I guess maybe that Adorno talks about false individualism or something like that. I think it'd be something like that is kind of what they're saying, and that it becomes where people are so kind of isolated and whatnot, but they can only kind of interpret themselves in the sense of the role of where they are immediately in their family, because that's the only person you're allowed to really be close to. And everyone else is kind of like dangerous, stranger danger or something like that. And so basically this social production is produced of where then these different objects, that's what is provided for you, for your desiring objects. That's what at least fills the content of it. But then I think on top of that is this problem of part of that social repression is that if that's producing a lack in the system, if that's putting in all these restrictions, all these names of the father into desiring production, then that is what's going to cause then this fixation on having objects of desire, and especially as something like just advertising, whatever. I need the hamburger, I need the whatever, the drink, I need a person for this, I need whatever. It's always has some kind of object that is just not anything that you're really connected to. And I think from that perspective, that then Lacan and whatnot is totally right. But I think what they're trying to get at is that, okay, that's something that itself is socially produced. That's a product of our society. So they'll eventually get into, well, not eventually, pretty soon, really. In the beginning of the third chapter, they'll talk about, tribal or, primitive, quote unquote, societies. And I think you could probably make the case that, it'd be pretty strange to think of tribal societies as fixated on a kind of consumerist mentality as we are. And I think that's kind of what they're getting at, in the sense that something has changed in the structure of how we desire. Not that it's kind of, I think they want to romanticize, tribal cultures necessarily. In fact, you'll see that they're very much into social repression as well, and cruelty and cruelty against the body. Yeah, we'll get in. The third section is awesome. I love it. We'll get into that, but I think for this, I would say that that's kind of what they're getting at with the idea that lack is something that's socially produced, and also Oedipus is socially produced, and that's what causes. So, but these things are effects, really. They're effects of social repression, which is the cause. But then, what is the cause? The cause is kind of has this quasi-causal structure where then Oedipus kind of turns back around and says, no, we need to repress desire. That's not what's desired. I feel like there's something else you said, Nathan, that I can't remember what. Oh wait, it was so you're saying that they were saying in some cases Oedipus is kind of not a thing, in other cases it's almost everything or whatnot.
They're
Is that
saying
right?
they're saying it exists, but it's in one. Okay, so one side they're saying it exists, but it's socially produced. It isn't something that it's universal, as you said. Which to me, that's like a non-issue. At the time of this book was written, nobody would have made that argument anymore. You know, no, I mean maybe I don't know, Joseph Campbell would have, but you know, no French continental philosopher would have made that argument. So who are they arguing against if they're making that argument? You know, I mean, and they wouldn't have taken anybody who would have said it was universal seriously. It's not worth that's too starved an argument for their sword. And so that's on one side. And then on the other side, they're saying that it's actually it's a myth. It's this made up thing, right? That's just grafted onto people as a way to explain themselves to them. So in one sense, they're saying it's real, although socially produced, which is, you know, a given. And in the other sense, they're saying that it is a made up thing that's grafted onto people, like to explain themselves to themselves. So, you know, and I was just like, I mean, I'm not like averse to them contradicting themselves. I'm fine with that, but it's a fine distinction that I found. And I was just, that's why I just wanted to bring that up and see what people thought of it, because I really don't think that the idea that Oedipus is universal is something that they're arguing against, because it's not an argument that anybody serious would have made. That's I think an important thing, important like historical thing to consider, given when the book was written and what was going on in the rest of philosophy, continental post-structuralism, et cetera. Postmodernism is even, you know, so I don't know. That's just something that I noticed. That's all.
So, so I know they do have a section called "To What Extent Oedipus Can Be Considered Universal" or something like that. So I think in that third chapter, they do talk more about that. Oh yeah, so they have a section in here about universalists. Basically, they're people that think that it's universal. Although I don't really know much about.
I see. Yeah,
exactly who they are. I don't think have I read that section? I guess maybe I did and I just forgot it. I don't know. But
I mean, in psychoanalysis, maybe there were, and I just don't know about it. But philosophically, I don't think that was something anybody would have taken seriously.
So one thing I'm kind of curious about, I guess, is so would Lacan's ideas aren't those kind of universal in a sense, at least in, you know, not in the fact that we all have, you know, nuclear families and capitalism and whatnot, but he's saying that, you know, this kind of triangulation, the three registers and all these things, that this at least is universal.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, I think that it's so like submission to, so that what creates the subject is a submission to the symbolic order, and that's, you know, we're subject to language, and that's what creates us. And so he, in a sense, like that's universal, right? But like it would necessarily manifest itself in radically different ways depending on how the language of whatever given subject you're talking about works. So it's going to look different no matter what, you know what I mean? It's definitely not something universal.
I never got the idea that they were saying that it was universal. I got the concept that psychoanalysis is an idea implemented through, like, it's not a universal identifier. It's on page 118. He says Oedipus is not a state of desire and drives. It is an idea, nothing but an idea that repression inspires in us concerning desire. Not even a compromise, but an idea in the service of repression, its propaganda or its propagation. So I think what he's saying is that at our core, we are productive machines that need kind of a combination of a transcendental and materialist understanding of our function, and that repression is inherent in the Oedipal idea that is causing this frustration. Like, but to break away from it, it'll destroy the very system itself if we do. So it's dangerous to even do this, and it is kind of paradoxical in a way, because if we break from this and become producing machines, this is explosive and revolutionary and dangerous, and this needs to be contained. So the Oedipal construct does that in a way that has us desiring our own repression, both sexually and materially, so that we don't become producing machines anyway. On 118, I thought I really liked this part, and I wanted to talk about it more. He says, if desire is repressed, this is not because it is desire for the mother and for the death of the father. On the contrary, desire becomes that only because it is repressed. It takes on the mask only under the reign of the repression that models the mask for it and plasters it on its face. And then further down in the same paragraph, he says, not that desire is asocial, on the contrary, but it is explosive. There is no desiring machine capable of being assembled without demolishing entire social sectors. Despite what some revolutionaries think about this, desire is revolutionary in its essence. Desire, not left-wing holidays, which I thought was a nice jab. And no society can tolerate a position of real desire without its structures of exploitation, servitude, and hierarchy being compromised. So for me, that seems to be what the text is suggesting. We are productive machines that are inherently being repressed by having this aspect of desire being lacking, this idea that we are presupposing on us rather than looking at the materialist use of it.
Yeah, and that's kind of predicated on this original capacity of desire, though, to repress itself with the body without organs. As part of it, what it does is that it has those repressing machines, if we remember towards the very beginning. But that's what's kind of, it uses those in order to kind of get desire to repress those features of itself. And I think that's, yeah, the way that it's socially produced, I think, is really important. And I think, so I think another aspect is, oh, okay, so that left-wing holidays thing, I think that's a reference to, so the May 68, the student revolt. Some people believe that it ended because the students went on holiday for the summer. And that's what eventually ended it. I think it's a reference to that Desire's student holiday, that eventually they just left, and that's what kept it from the revolt from actually occurring. So I think that's a reference there. Anyways, but so I think one thing that is that's getting at what they're critiquing, in at least as far as psychoanalysis, what it's doing in its role in all this, is that Freudian idea. So Freud, he seems to take the idea that it's first and foremost this psychic repression that then causes, and then social production is almost something that necessarily has to keep down these, the aggressive or kind of antisocial nature of the id. And that therefore we have to have this society that is built around repressing the psyche. And I think there's something like that that's kind of what they're getting at in the sense. And then of course it becomes psychoanalysis then becomes this idea of, trying to figure out what's wrong with us in our psyche in order to repress it, because we can't have, these bad drives operating and doing all these things, because they'll tear civilization apart. I don't know. So I read, what is it called? The Civilization is Discontents. I read that a really long time ago, but I don't remember hardly anything from it. I guess, I don't know. My brain is kind of deteriorating these days. But I think Freud kind of argues something like that, like this necessity for social repression in some sense, at least because the id unleashed is a very destructive thing. I think that's something
Freud
like
was
what they're
pro-
critiquing.
Yeah, Freud was pro sublimation for sure. He thought, it was good that we were repressed and channeled our sexuality and desires and stuff into like just keeping the thing going. Again, I feel like, I don't know. I see, again, I'm not familiar enough with like the psychoanalytic winds of the time outside of Lacan, other than like Lacan was against all these guys too. So it's sort of like they're against Lacan 20% of the time, 80% of the time they're either with him or like next to him, and then they're against, I don't know, Melanie Klein or something like that, or whatever. But I don't know. There's just like a lot. I feel like there's a lot of like no, I don't know. I lost it. Never mind.
So to bring Nietzsche into it, I spent a long time since I read Civilization Its Discontents as well. But when I remember when I read it, it reminded me of Nietzsche, because in the second essay in the genealogy, he tells this story of one, I guess it would be a tribe, conquering another one. And, the conquered tribe has all these, I don't know what, I guess instinct drives desires that they've been able to give expression to freely because they were consistent with the norms of that local society. But then when that tribe is conquered by another one, that tribe has different norms of what's appropriate expression. And so they disallow the expression of the conquered tribe, so they don't allow them to express themselves the way they have. And so then what happens is that conquered tribe has to, the way Nietzsche thinks of these drives and things, they're going to go somewhere. It's not like you can just shut them down. And so if they can't have external expression, they go internal and they become internalized. And they begin eating on the insides of these people, and you generate the bad conscience. But on the other hand, you have the positive effect that internalization of all that power inflates the whole world of consciousness and makes it this huge domain of creativity and so on. But that's kind of what I'm wondering if there's kind of echoes of that in Deleuze and Guattari. And then the similar sort of thing with Civilization Its Discontents. Again, this is from a long time ago, but my recollection is something like, someone told me one time that Freud was trying to give a sort of evolutionary explanation of the development of consciousness and civilization. And so, the idea being that we have these, primitive drives and so on, but that contemporary society has evolved, much more quickly than the psychological makeup of the human animal. And so we have all these, drives and so on that would be destructive in contemporary civilization. So again, civilization has an interest in suppressing all that stuff. And so anyway, that I'm thinking that maybe Deleuze and Guattari are thinking of along those lines, that by its very nature, at least the way it's been construed so far, civilization is almost necessarily a repressive project. It has to repress certain kinds of desires that it deems incompatible with its own well-functioning. And, that could, what desires those are could vary fairly dramatically, from one society to another. Like, for example, he makes these comments, or Nietzsche makes these comments like, you could take a Viking, for example, that has all these, that's like, this is probably stereotyping, but, it's all about blood and conquering and hacking off people's heads and all that kind of stuff. You put them in the Viking society and they're like, go, dude, great, we'll make you king. You put that guy in today's society and he's either going to be executed or, put in prison for the rest of his life. So anyway, I think they think that civilization by its nature is repressive.
I think that, well, so also this is something that I thought of about that, like desire is revolutionary. So again, like from like a historical look at the book, right? It's coming out of May 68. It's coming out of Marcuse. It's coming out of free love. It's coming out of all these types of things, right? So Freud's deal with sex and how sexual repression, you know, created all these neuroses, you know, is what was wrong with everybody, right? And I think that he was right. But then look what happens when you break those chains of, and now there's free love. Now you can do whatever you want. You're still fucked up, you know? So that to me, it's like, there's this sort of, again, like, and that to me is like why the book in that sense is probably a product of its time. Is like, to me, there's this idea that, oh, well, if only we could just be free and let our desire, and I don't mean just sexual desire, I mean, like, you know, whatever that case may be, like break the chains of this society. I feel like that this section is following Marcuse in a sense, right, Chase? Like, you know what I mean? The one-dimensional man and all that type of thing. So it just seems like, I think what we know now, you know, or not what we know, but what we have seen since the 70s, and how, you know, there's something wrong with sex. There's a gap, you know, there's you know, it made sense to do what, to free society of repression. And then when you free that repression, you know, we're still, Zizek talks about it a lot too. But anyway, that's just something I thought of with that whole desire is revolutionary and all this kind of, it starts to sound kind of utopian or whatever. And that's just sort of my criticism of that.
I want to jump in on that point. I think that's where they're trying to lean against or like push back against Reich, because I think that was Reich's idea. This may be more like, because they mentioned Marcuse and Reich saying how, you know, people with this more like positive idea of what the unconscious holds in it have been like, you know, criticized, and they give the example, and I thought that was a really interesting idea. I forget what page it is, but where they're mentioning how like cruel, we think of all our unconscious desires as like where our true cruelty comes from, but they're saying like there's nothing more cruel than like the insomniac rationality. But yeah, and so they're kind of just like mentioning that point of like, oh, this unconscious is like everything's going to be pretty if we just stopped repressing it. And then that was kind of like a question I had when they end up more explicitly saying like this is where Reich falls short, and that's on page 119, when they're getting to saying, consequently, revolutionary investments seemed to him such that the desire moving within it simply coincided with an economic rationality. And I'm not sure like how to, like, I don't really know. I don't think that I know what that means. But I've just been hearing references on how like they lean against the idea that for Reich, on the other side of repression, we would just have like a rational, everything would fall in smooth. And I think that's where they say like, well, no, we might not, you know, we shouldn't have like full confidence on what would lie on the other side of repression. The unconscious would just be like totally good to us.
Yeah, I think that's right. So they get into more of those things. Okay, I probably sound like, add this to my bingo card. Every time I mention a later section in this book, because I'm going to do that now and say that they mainly talk about this in the 4th chapter, towards the very end, actually. But I think that's, I think they are somewhat arguing, you know, yeah, desire is revolutionary and all this, but I don't think it's this. It is definitely more subtle than a kind of a free love kind of thing. And I think it's definitely, it's more, so let's see if I'm not getting this mixed up with 1,000 Plateaus, but they, so they have a kind of pragmatic use of the idea of utopian uses that you can basically, it's almost like a thing, like, I guess like, okay, I have no idea, but this is my this is an imaginal projection of what I would think Zizek would argue. Basically, he has this idea about like, there's impossible things, but you have to like dare to do those impossible things. Because who the hell is saying they're impossible anyways? They have something kind of like that in this idea of like a kind of a utopian kind of desire, but they also have something that kind of like a notion of permanent revolution instead of, we just simply, clear out all the fascist, and then just unleash desire and everything is just wonderful. I think they definitely not agree with that. And there's some people that have argued that Deleuze himself was something of a ascetic. I think Badiou argues that, and I think he's actually partially correct, although he's an ascetic in a very strange manner that I'm not going to go into. Actually, I think I might write about this in my thesis eventually, but either way. So one thing I think that is an interesting kind of component that so I read in the Wikipedia of Anti-Oedipus, the Wikipedia for the book. Amazing, huh? Like, who would have thought to do that? I did it. It was amazing.
You wrote it.
Yeah. And okay. And the part that I thought was interesting was, so there were these psychoanalysts that wrote something about the student protesters in May 68. And they said that these student protesters had some kind of infantile complex, and this is where that reference to what has happened here, where psychoanalysts are arguing for more anality. This terrible pun. Like, how did it come to this? And I think that's a reference to those people that they're arguing that these protesters had, anally expulsive personalities, instead of anally retentive, which they should have been for like good order. They had, this Oedipal rebellion against the father because they were, allowed too much anal expulsion, too much. So, yeah, I think, okay, so Lacan says in the Wikipedia that Lacan was just like, oh my God, what the fuck is this? Like, this did not come from any of, the people associated with me. Like, and he was right, I think. Yeah, I think he was. And but I think that's kind of part of what there's still something in enough kind of this conservative Freudianism present that's kind of what they're targeting. And I think that it's so alien to what we think of in the United States today that it's kind of hard to get our minds around. But I think that is indeed the milieu of their time. But I think it is. But also, I think that's kind of interesting in one sense that shows this kind of extreme reduction of these social issues, or you call it social repression or whatever, to psychic repression. That it's being reduced to, it's just these mommy daddy problems. It's a way of kind of making those social aspects secondary. And I think that's one of the main arguments they're really making against psychoanalysis in this book, is they're saying Oedipus, it's always going to bring us back to this idea of the family and to psychic kind of personal consciousness kind of stuff, when exactly we need to go in the opposite direction and instead think of the unconscious as involved in social production or and affected by social production, at least coextensive with it. And I think that's a good example of how they're trying to put something to use that could go against those ideas of, oh yeah, protesters, they're just angry at dad, and even I guess there's kind of somewhat of a similarity. Even today, you see there's some people, it seems kind of even really kind of strange and uncommon today, I guess. I don't even really know. I have no reference point. I read books in French philosophy all day. I have no reference for what is going on, So, but okay, I think the argument that people put of, there's some kind of something occurring in society, I don't know, protest or some riots, something like this, and people say, oh, we just need to be taught better family values. We need a focus on the family. We need to, we need to have choices, in the family. We need to have the family decide. So I still think you see that kind of political use of the family and how it usually ends up being this kind of thing where it just reproduces these repressive structures of society, but it kind of presents itself as, oh, well, the family is just this natural thing. It's great,
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I wanted to point out page 112 when you're talking about, that just came to mind when you're talking, Chase, because I got a kick out of that. When they were talking about like the what do they call it? Like the neutrality of like the psychoanalyst, just like, oh yeah, listening, as opposed to just like, I'm just imagining like a schizoanalyst over here where they says Oedipus is a fucking drag, keep it up, analysis will be stopped. We'll apply a shock treatment towards you. Stop saying daddy, mommy. Yeah, just kind of thought that was entertaining. But I was also going to note that I guess I'm wondering what Eric, you were mentioning when they say, didn't Reich and Marcuse make the same move previously? And I think that maybe when we started the group, that was my question of like, what really does the difference look like between them and Reich and Marcuse? And I think last section they hinted at it a bunch too, and we didn't get to talk about it. But one of my questions was like this idea of like them leaning against the kind of critique of ideology, as if we just kind of like shifted our way of thinking, then things would be okay. And I feel like that leans against the same idea with Reich's, their accusation of him as like economic rationalist, as if like if the people weren't being duped, if society wasn't repressing us and like tricking us and giving us illusions, then we could think rationally and everything would work smoothly. As opposed, I feel like they're saying like the unconscious desire is still going to like almost like do what it wants, and work in different ways.
Well, according to I just forgot his name, Joey, the commentary, what's his name, Eugene Holland, is it? Yeah,
that's it.
So he makes this, he makes the claim of that psychoanalysis imposes fixed identities more broadly, so just at the very bottom of 110, they say, in the third place, a nomadic polyvocal use of the conjunctive synthesis as opposed to the segregative and biunivocal use made of them. There again, this biunivocal use, illegitimate from the point of view of the unconscious itself, has what appear to be two moments. And the first one is a moment that is racist, nationalist, and religious. And what Holland says is that one of their things is this sense of nomadic. I don't know what the next word should be. Nomadic something, but
Vocal.
Yeah, but like that's the adjective. What's the noun? Nomadic consciousness or nomadic?
Nomadic subject.
Nomadic subjects. There you go. So and then he mentions racist, nationalist, and religious. And what Holland suggests is that psychoanalysis is invested in this notion of relatively fixed and immobile identities. And and that the general idea is me and not, you know, me and the other, and in a sense of opposition. There is us and there is them. You know, there's our nation and their nation. There is our religion and their religion. There is our race and their race. And that, and again, I'm not qualified to say, but that they seem to think that psychoanalysis supports this kind of oppositional identities, whereas this notion of a nomadic identities, and again, I use this as an example in a particular case where a member of my wife's family, her identity seems to be relatively fluid. And, you know, and today, you know, this business of, you know, racial identities, you know, that we like to, you know, like you fill out these forms, are you Hispanic or are you white or are you this? And people are like, you know, I'm biracial and one of my parents is multiracial. And so you have these, you know, there's people today that are calling for a more, you know, to not get so hung up on identities. You know, what specific group with specific boundaries do I have? And so, you know, I think in that regard, I don't think it's necessarily something we can say, oh, well, this really only had value, you know, when they were writing this book, because again, and based on this simple passage and probably others, I think Holland has a point, you know, that identities, to the degree we're invested in rigid fixed identities, we're just asking for division and so on.
And I'm wondering too, from a Deleuzian standpoint, from a modern social lens, like for me, how they would view like transgender communities and various sexual orientations that kind of coalesce with the racial division you're mentioning about with like nomadic groups and tribes, because they seem to be saying when we go back to this like traditional family values mentality of the family, like you're not you're not transgender, you just weren't you have an anal fixation because you weren't hugged enough as a parent, or you have some ancestral desire. When we start ascribing psychic or repression to that it creates this almost misery in the system itself, because and that they're looking at the family as kind of like a unit of recording, the body without organs, where there is some genealogical relation, but it's not an ideological construct that creates division, as you said, that there has to be fluidity in identity, both socially and sexually, and able to express itself. And it's less about going back to family values and more about the family guiding a person to say, hey, we're just genealogically related to you, and we're in this system isn't necessarily something that's a representation of your sexuality or social identity. Because on page 120, he says, and I found it interesting when he mentioned what a family's role is that social production would need at its disposal on the recording surface of the socius an agent that is also capable of acting on, of inscribing the recording surface of desire. Such an agent exists in the family. And before, in the previous chapter, he says, by placing the distorting mirror of incest before desire, that's what you wanted, isn't it? Desire is shamed, stupefied. It is placed in a situation without exit. It is easily persuaded to deny itself in the name of more important interests of civilization. So it's almost like when you aren't able to sexually express, it's tied to the aspect of social expression. So they're less tribalism and more constant productive creativity, where everyone's identity is kind of in this flux, which seems to be the essence of schizoanalysis.
Yeah, let's see. I hate to bring in 1,000 Plateaus stuff, but anyways, why not? Let's mention it. But I think they emphasize more that idea of fluid. not sure if fluid identity would be the right term, because they really want to get rid of the whole idea of identity as something important. I mean, I don't think they would necessarily deny it or say it has some kind of use in some way. Even kind of, I'm trying to remember the line from 1,000 Plateaus, but they say that in some cases there's actually like a kind of like representational identity politics is actually kind of called for. That it can actually be liberating in some cases, but that they're operating on a different level. And I think it's a little difficult to kind of suss out exactly what that is in Anti-Oedipus. Although they definitely get into the idea of sexuality as essentially as non-binary. It's in-dimensional. It can be any number of dimensions, which is interesting. I think
I really
that
like
was a
that
few
part.
weeks ago that they mentioned more of that, and then they'll talk about that more in the 4th chapter. But yeah, I think
Bingo! I got a bingo.
yes. Oh, really? Oh, yeah. There's something. Oh, yeah. So another thing, kind of, somewhat to go back to the idea of what is going on with their questions of kind of like free love and is this kind of like even kind of like a reckless thing they're saying, kind of unleash desire. So 1,000 Plateaus is somewhat notoriously more cautious in its language. Something that Nick Land hates. Nick Land does not like that, which is kind of funny because Nick Land is the ultimate example of someone who should have used caution, but he hated that aspect the most, the aspect that he should have most paid attention to. But the plateau on the body thought organs in 1,000 Plateaus is a lot of it. It talks about the body thought organs more as a kind of as an experimental practice, but saying that this experimental practice that caution is a rule that's imminent to experimentation, because this blind experimentation with zero caution isn't even really experimentation. It's just kind of annihilation. And so there's some people believe that this, and it's almost constant in almost every plateau, there's some kind of cautionary word in some way. And rumor has it that this is because they were both disturbed by some of the arguments that people were making about Anti-Oedipus, saying that it was this kind of like a free love hippie sort of thing. And they apparently didn't like that. And so they're more explicit about how it needs to be a more intelligent application, I think, in 1,000 Plateaus. So I don't know if that helps or not, but yeah, that's basically what's going on.
It's always the retort, don't you notice? Anytime you start talking about sexual expression or identity or having some aspect of breaking away from pre-established systems, there's always an appeal to hedonism. I don't understand it. It's like, well, you're just an Epicurean cheese party goer. And I that's always the retort. And instead of focusing on what is being said, it's like this derogatory attack. Like, it's so strange. It's almost predictable.
Right, but I just want to say it when I know what you mean and I agree. But what I was trying to point out when I brought that up was that like that's like literally what people did in the late 60s. You know, this is the thing, like the love-ins and the, you know, what is it? Guns, dope, fucking in the streets. Is that what they called it? You know, it's like, so it was a lot of that going on. And it's because of which, speaking of Adorno, he would have been horrified. I think like some of his students got naked in his class, and he like never recovered. I mean, that may have been what killed him. But you know, I'm just that, not necessarily that the philosophy is that, but like, you know, like, again, I get what you're saying, but it did happen though. Like, people actually did that stuff, like, you know, en masse. So that's all I was saying.
Yeah, and to kind of just carry that forward just for a second, you know, because like you know, I agree with you, Joseph, and you, Nathan, that yeah, it's often, it's far too often that it's sort of a call for expanding a horizon is conflated with abandonment of principles or regularity of any kind, meaning like, oh, you want to allow X, Y, and Z to do, you know, A, B, or C. Well, then why don't everybody just start having sex with dogs and have, you know, whatever.
Yes, the abandonment of regularity and principle. Yes, immediately. That's always where it goes. You just want to have sex with dogs or children, or you're just like, it's like
you're a madman, yeah, or something. You just,
no,
you want to abandon all these values that uphold our society. But so my thing is, I'm with you, and so I think, but I want to be. But then it's difficult sometimes to resist. I feel it in myself, like that sort of questioning when certain phrases are put forward, like in the text on 116. I don't mean to make us keep talking because I know we're about to end, but when they say things like desire is revolutionary in its essence on 116 on the first paragraph, I immediately think, well, all desire revolutionary in its essence? What about desire for suppression, or what about desire for dominance and suffering and for ideological status quo? You know, is that revolutionary necessarily? You know, I don't know. That's, I mean, like, so I immediately start that questioning. I immediately want to start poking around at they say things like desire is revolutionary in its essence. I think, like, what about the desire for the end of all revolutions or something like that? And it also leads me to think about things that I do have one real concern, and it's not that Deleuze and Guattari are hippies and they're just like they're Desaadian hedonists that are trying to take my freedoms or intrude on my life with their disgusting mode of pleasure making. It's not that at all. It's my one thing was just a thought that I had, which was way more at the end of the reading. Now, to get us to the end of the reading, at the end of our time, they talk about the
props hunter, we miss you.
Thanks. The body without organs on which social repression is recorded. I just had this thought. And it was they said that the body without organs, basically, on which this social repression is recorded. I think it's I don't know if it's the body without organs itself that's doing it, or it's the social repression that is a part of the figuration of that body without organs that's doing it. Then again, I guess that's hard to distinguish the two. But they said it primarily represses desiring production. And I actually don't see where on the page that is, but I have it in quotes on the marginalia, so I know that it's there somewhere on page 121 and 122. They're talking about this. But my point is, I think do D&G want to? I'm reading a note, like I was just reading. That's why I said do D&G. Like I wrote it down and I was reading it out loud. Excuse that. Do Deleuze and Guattari want to liberate desires or acts? This is a point I just wanted to make really quickly to try and because I always like making these lines of demarcation, because I think my question is, do Deleuze and Guattari want to liberate desires, or do they want to liberate acts? And then here, let me finish. Lacan sees us as being totally trapped. He sees us as being totally caught in the cycle of desire, totally beholden to master signifiers, totally ensnared by symbols. We are fucked. You are fucked. You can't get out. And any attempt at doing so is a fantasy. Now sit down and, whatever, listen to my lecture or whatever. And, our session was 5 minutes today. Goodbye. Get out of my office. Like he's very much like that. He sees us as trapped. Zizek sees hope in Hegel and says, well, we can liberate our actions. We can act without. His goal, Zizek's explicit goal, is to find a way to get us to act in a way that isn't justified by the big other. He says we need to learn how to act without a big other. Lacan would say you're stupid. That doesn't make sense. You need a big other. Stop. You're going to confuse these people. You're going to beguile them with these promises of freedom, whatever. And but here's my next thing: does Deleuze and Guattari, are they trying to liberate maybe not desires or acts, but desiring production? And if they are, that kind of seems like Marx aiming to liberate production, like the capitalist mode of production in the productive capacity of labor being fettered by capital, right? So, I mean, I guess there's a homology there, and I'd have to do some more thinking as to whether or not I like that, but it's the closest thing I'm thinking. What do you guys?
Well, I think you're right that that's referenced, that's about Marx. I think they, remember page numbers, but they do talk about Marx and their theories of production a fair amount. So I think that connection, but also the whole, like, can there be a big other is making me think about the very beginning of this chapter and the full bit about Nietzsche and God. And it was talking about the Father, but not the big other there, but, that whole bit about how Nietzsche's, whole thing about the announcement of the death of God was actually that it announced that it was unimportant. Everyone already plenty of people, rationalists saying, oh, we've got past God. That wasn't like but his thing was like, no, we haven't got past God because we still act as if God exists in all of our actions. And so for Lacan, that would be like, it seems like with Lacan, as you're describing him, that there's no getting past God. Like Bataille, what I've read about Bataille, there was like being an atheist means always experiencing a lack of God, not like it was an atheist, but like there was always a big other that you would be kind of missing if you were an atheist, that like religion used to fill. But the Deleuze is like, no, our goal is to, not just acknowledge that God is dead, but to move past it, to, finally stop, finally change the structures as if God didn't actually exist, instead of just saying he didn't exist, which is what he's kind of using psychoanalysis of doing with the Father, and how they'll say, oh, yes, the Father is illusionary, but then they'll still act as if he exists in their analysis. I think.
Yeah, and I think, the way I read some of that stuff was that he thinks, or that they think that whenever you're appealing to some sort of ultimate authority, whatever it is, you're implicitly still subject to the shadows of God. And, that those things are so much a part of our culture and the way we think that we don't even realize the degree to which we're still relying upon, these old tropes about power and authority. We don't even realize that we're, no, I'm an atheist, but nevertheless, I'm still relying upon these, these authoritarian concepts of power that are still active in what I do.
Yeah, like what he was talking about, like the law is the game. Like people think about the law like it's a sovereign, maybe a big other. I don't really know psychoanalysis, but as if the law is there because there was some sovereign that tells you the law is like, no, this is the rule of the game. So it is not that it doesn't exist at all. If you break the laws, cop might arrest you. People will, repress you, but it's not there because there was some innate sovereign that will, that made it so it's there as part of the game itself.
Rather like that part, the rule of the game, rather than a law.
That's just because you like Wittgenstein.
What? All right, I have to bow out. This has been awesome. I really enjoyed this and I needed it this Friday. Thank you all for the wonderful discussion. I appreciate you. Take care, gentlemen, ladies, everybody. Bye.
Yeah, I think it's time I hit the dusty trail myself. I think we did a good job, everybody. Go team, go us. We're really smart.
Woohoo!
We did it. We did it.
Yeah. Good job, everyone,
I'm proud of us.
except me.
I give you all A's.
Thank you.
Give you a C, but you know, I promise, I trust that you'll be able to do better next time. All right.
Except for
I got
Hunter.
a B in a class last semester.
Oh, it's disappointing.
Yeah, I know.
It's
That's the
not.
first
it's not the
B I've
grading.
gotten in like over a decade, I think.
I think
Oh, you got a B?
somebody's
I got a
here to
B.
drink my beer, so I gotta go attend to that.
I didn't really
Sorry, what's your
care.
beer?
So
Or a C. Oh, God.
Good.
I got this a dog barking. Bye.
Bye, Hunter.
I had when I was in grad school, a professor call me in after one of his classes and say, I should give you a B plus because your paper sucked, but I'm going to give you an A minus because I'm a nice guy. Like, great.
That is a nice guy. Yeah.
Oh, Nevitt, also, and you know, Chase or Eric, you're interested as well. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that I'm a Lacan fanboy. But you know, Nevitt, you talk a lot about, or you mentioned in Discord your familiarity with Soto Zen.
Yeah, which is some familiarity. Yeah.
There's like I would assume that like you've read stuff on it, maybe, you know, gone to talks, you know, all that kind of stuff. So you know Dogen and all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm reading a book right now called The Signifier Pointing at the Moon, Psychoanalysis, Zen Buddhism. And there's several books that talk about they talk about Freud and they talk about Heidegger and they talk about Nietzsche and that kind of thing, you know, and compare it to Buddhism, specifically Tibetan or Zen. But this is the first book I found that is specifically on Lacanian theory and Zen. And I don't know, my own introduction to Lacan was probably like, I kind of read blindly and went down different corridors. I will say Zizek was not my introduction to it, but I've read his stuff that's an introduction to Lacan, and I don't think that it's a good introduction.
Oh, really?
I
So
think
you would not recommend Zizek as an introduction to Lacan?
no, because I think that he is Lacanian, but I think that he's so far developed his own thing that it's like Zizekian. Like he's not like he's his own thing. That's my reading of it. Again, this stuff is like, you know, I mean, you guys know it's nuts. It's just like never ending. But I just remember you saying that you were familiar with Zen, specifically Soto Zen. And that's what this guy that wrote it is, a practicing Lacanian psychoanalyst and a Zen priest. So in the Soto tradition under at this, like in San Francisco, like the Shunryu
Oh, really?
San Francisco Zen Center and all that.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm associated with Austin Zen Center, and they're connected to San Francisco.
Yeah, and I go to the Austin Zen Center too. Actually.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Been there before.
Small world.
Yeah, and I mean that comment I made about finding nothing but the world. I mean that's kind of I was thinking of Zen, but I mean it's kind of my personal experience. But it's what one of the things that resonates with Zen for me is just that experience of there's just nothing there. And so then when you guys were talking about Lacan in that same kind of vein, that's what popped into my mind is this just emptiness and vacancy at the core of what I am.
Yeah, and I think that I think that Derrida also touches on stuff that like there's resonances between, you know, Zen Buddhism and Derrida for sure, and like Heidegger as well, like the idea of time, you know.
There's actually a book I don't even remember what the title of it, but there's, you know, Dogen actually wrote a book called Time, or not a book. There's a section in whatever his, you know, this collection of his works, there's a section called Time and Being. And apparently someone wrote a book looking at being and time and comparing it to Dogen's Time and Being and finding some similarities there. So
I think I had that PDF somewhere, but this book also talks about Zen
Really?
for
Oh.
not a lot, but a little bit. Yeah. Compares Zen to the Stoic kind of sage, I guess, were these. Yeah.
Okay. I also, Chase, I have a book that I got from I have it currently checked out from the Texas State Library, but I've finished it, called Deleuze and Buddhism.
Yes, I was the one that requested that for the Texas State Library. And I'm glad you see, you said you read it?
Yeah, I found like about half of it I thought was like really insightful, and the other half I was like, I'm not really familiar enough with Deleuze to know exactly what these guys are talking about. But there was some stuff that I really liked. The one about the I think there's some kind of like Japanese romantic poet or writer. It was kind of like viewing Zen Buddhism and through a Deleuzian lens through that guy. I'd have to look it up and find it.
Yeah, so I requested it. It was very expensive too, and they bought it. I checked it out, but I did not read anything in it. I think part of it's just because whatever, there's other things to read.
Yeah.
But yeah, it happened. I'm glad at least somebody read it though. That's great.
Yeah, it's worth a look.
Can you elaborate on how you think there are connections between Derrida and Zen Buddhism? I'm interested. Derrida is kind of more my thing right now.
Okay, well, it's about how the binary like the binary structure of language is like how Derrida was trying to sort of how would you say, like explode, displace. It's been a while. Like I have shifted completely into this stuff, but I was further into that like last year. but with Derrida, it has to do with how he's trying to like explode binaries and get rid of like the what is it, the speech writing, presence absence, the hierarchy. Like there's always an implied hierarchy in any binary in a linguistic system, and how there are similar concepts in Zen Buddhism with the sort of like form is emptiness, emptiness is form, emptiness is emptiness, form is form. From the form is emptiness, emptiness is form is in the Heart Sutra, but then also Zen takes it further and says emptiness is emptiness and form is form. So it's this sort of thing where it's like, I just read this too. It's this like, not this. I'd have to look at some stuff and get back to you exactly, but it has to do with the way that Derrida's like destabilization. That's the word I'm looking for. Derrida destabilized language, semiotics, Western philosophy. He, pretty much like it was like, he destabilized this entire thing. And I think that Zen, in a sense, is in certain respects a similar attempt to do that. Coming from a different place, of course. Like China and medieval Japan, but it's something similar is happening there in this sort of like attempt to destabilize all that has come before. Like koans are like that.
Yeah, so that actually kind of reminds me of what Deleuze says about Zen and the logic of sense. I can't remember if I told this to you, Deirdre, or not. I can't, but maybe I did. I remember telling somebody about this. Honestly, I have no idea what's going on most of the time. I'll just say that. But so what Deleuze says about Zen is that there's this kind of practice where somebody will be fixated on the meaning of something, looking for some kind of signification of something, like what is Buddha nature, thinking and the kind of the art of the Zen master will be redirecting it from that kind of course where, okay, say it's looking for some kind of abstract kind of conceptual idea. The idea is to then suddenly switch over to demarcation and point to a state of affair. So there's other
We definitely
aspect
did talk
of language.
about that. We talked about
Yeah.
that last weekend. Yes.
Yeah. So then, yeah, it's like, okay, what is Buddha nature? And you're thinking very abstractly, conceptually, and then all of a sudden switch over to pointing to a frog with the staff, demarcation, state of affair. Or somebody's thinking too much in terms of material state of affairs, suddenly switch over and say, you know, the grass, what is grass? The grass is Buddha nature. So it's kind of, in a way, I think you could make something of a comparison, at least a little bit, to Derrida in the sense that there's also kind of disrupting of binaries there, I think. At least in terms of, I mean, I think Deleuze's kind of in general interested in doing that. Definitely an anti-Oedipus. But yeah, I don't know.
I know it seems
That's
in
kind of an interesting
Derrida,
question.
the binaries in Derrida seem to be maybe I don't know enough yet, but they seem overstated by a lot of people, that they're really a tool for kind of getting to that middle voice, but they're not like the crux of the argument, so much as people seem to think they are. But I see where you're going, and it makes sense.
All right, I got to head out, guys. Great, everybody. That was really fun.
Yeah.
And I will see you guys next time.
All right.
Hey.
See you later.
Bye.